Note on the text. J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings is often erroneously called a trilogy, but is in fact a single novel consisting of 6 books plus appendices, sometimes published in 3 volumes. The first volume, The Fellowship of the Ring, was published in Great Britain by the London firm George Allen and Unwin on the 29th of July, 1954, and an American edition followed on 21st of October of the same year, published by Hood and Mifflin Company of Boston. In the production of this first volume, Tolkien experienced what became for him a continual problem: printer's errors and compositors' mistakes, including well-intentioned corrections of his sometimes idiosyncratic usage. These corrections include the altering of dwarves to dwarves, elvish to elvish, further to farther, Nasturtians to Nasturtiums, try to say, and, worst of all to Tolkien, elven to elfin. In works such as The Lord of the Rings, containing invented languages and delicately constructed nomenclatures, errors and inconsistencies impede both on the understanding and the appreciation of serious readers. And Tolkien had many such readers from very early on, even before the publication of the third volume, which contained much hitherto unrevealed information on the invented languages and writing systems. Tolkien received many letters from readers within these systems, in addition to numerous enquiries on the finer points of their usage. The second volume, The Two Towers, was published in England on the 11th of November, 1954, in the United States on the 21st of April, 1955. Meanwhile, Tolkien worked to keep a promise he had made in the foreword to Volume 1, that an index of names and strange words would appear in the third volume, and as originally planned, this index would contain much etymological information on the languages, particularly on the Elven tongue, with a large vocabulary. It proved the chief cause of the delay in publishing Volume 3, which in the end contained no index at all, only an apology from the publisher for its absence. For Tolkien, who had abandoned work on it after indexing Volumes 1 and 2, believing its size and therefore cost to be ruinous. Volume 3, The Return of the King, finally appeared in England on the 20th of October, 1955, and in the United States on the 5th of January, 1956. With the appearance of the third volume, The Lord of the Rings was published in its entirety, and its first edition text remained virtually unchanged for a decade. Tolkien had made a few small corrections, but further errors entered The Fellowship of the Ring in its December 1954 second impression, when the printer, having distributed the type after the first printing, reset the book without informing the author or the publisher. These include misrepresentations of the original printed text, that is, words and phrases that read acceptably in context but which depart from Tolkien's wording as originally written and published. In 1965, stemming from what then appeared to be copyright problems in the United States, an American paperback firm published an unauthorized and non-royalty paying edition of The Lord of the Rings. For this new edition by Ace Books, the text of the narrative was reset, thus introducing new typographical errors. The appendices, however, were reproduced photographically from the hardcover edition and remained consistent with it. Tolkien set to work on his first revision of the text so that a newly revised and authorized edition could successfully compete on the American market. This first revision of the text was published in America in paperback by Ballantine Books under license from the Hood and Mifflin. In October 1965, in addition to revisions within the text itself, Tolkien replaced his original foreword with a new one. He was pleased to remove the original foreword. In his check copy, he wrote of it, "Confusing as it does real personal matters with the machinery of the tale is a serious mistake." Tolkien also added an extension to the prologue and an index, not the detailed index of names promised in the first edition, but rather a bold index with only names and page references. Additionally, at this time, the appendices were greatly revised. Tolkien received his copies of the Ballantine edition in late January 1966, and in early February he recorded in his diary that he had worked for some hours on the appendices in Ballantine version, and found more errors than I at first expected. Soon after this, he sent a small number of further revisions to Ballantine for the appendices, including the now well-known edition of Estella Bulger as wife of Meriadoc in the family trees in Appendix C. Most of these revisions, which entered variously in the third and fourth impressions, June and August 1966 of Volume 3, and which were not always inserted correctly, thereby causing further confusion in the text. Somehow never made it into the main sequence of revision in the 3 volumes British hardcover edition, and for long remained anomalies. Tolkien once wrote concerning the revision of The Lord of the Rings that perhaps he had failed to keep his notes in order. This errant branch of revision seems likely to be an example of that disorder, either in his notes or in the ability of his publishers to follow them with utmost accuracy. The revised text first appeared in Great Britain in a 3-volume hardcover second edition from Allen and Unwin on 27th of October 1966, but again there were problems. Although the revisions Tolkien sent to America of the text itself were available to be utilized in the new British edition, his extensive revisions to the appendices were lost after being entered into the Ballantine edition. Allen and Unwin were forced to reset the appendices using the copy as published in the first Ballantine edition. This did not include Tolkien's second small set of revisions sent to Ballantine, but more significantly, it did include a great number of errors and omissions, many of which were not discovered until long afterwards. Thus, in the appendices, a close scrutiny of the first edition text and of much later corrected impressions of the second edition. It is necessary to discern whether any particular change in the edition is authorial or erroneous. In America, the revised text appeared in the hardcover in the 3-volume edition published by Houghton Mifflin on 27th of February 1967. This text was evidently photo offset from the 1966 Allen and Unwin 3-volume hardcover and is thus consistent with it. Aside from the first printing of the second Houghton Mifflin edition, which has a 1967 date on the title page, none of the many reprintings is dated. After the initial printings of this edition, which bore a 1966 copyright notice, the date of the copyright was changed in 1965 to match the statement in the Ballantine edition. This change had caused a great deal of confusion for librarians and other researchers who have tried to sort out the sequence and publication of these editions. Meanwhile, Tolkien spent much of the summer of 1966 further revising the text. In June, he learned that any more revisions were too late for inclusion in the 1966 Allen and Unwin's second edition, and he recorded in his diary, "But I am attempting to complete my work on the revisions. I cannot leave it while it is all in my mind. So much time has been wasted in my work by this consistent breaking of threads." This major set of revisions Tolkien himself made to the text during his lifetime. They were added to the second impression in 1967 of the 3-volume hardcover Allen and Unwin, second edition. The revisions themselves mostly include corrections of nomenclature and attempts at consistency of usage throughout the 3 volumes. Some small alterations were made by Tolkien in the 1969 1-volume India paper edition. J.R.R. Tolkien died in 1973. His third son and literary executor, Christopher Tolkien, sent a large number of further corrections of misprints, mainly in the appendices and index, to Allen and Unwin for use in their editions in 1974. Most of these corrections were typographical and in line with his father's expressed intent in his own Czech copies. Since 1974, Christopher Tolkien has sent additional corrections as errors have been discovered to the British publishers of The Lord of the Rings, Allen and Unwin Hyman, and now HarperCollins, who have tried to be conscientious in the impossible task of maintaining a textual integrity in whichever editions of The Lord of the Rings they have published. However, every time the text has been reset for publication in a new format, e.g. the various paperback editions published in England in the 1970s and 1980s, huge numbers of new misprints have crept in, though at times these errors have been observed and corrected in later printings. Still, throughout these years, the 3-volume British hardcover edition has retained the highest textual integrity. In the United States, the text of the Ballantine paperback has remained unchanged for more than 3 decades after Tolkien added his few revisions in 1966. The text in all of the Houghton Mifflin editions remained unchanged from the 1967, when Houghton Mifflin photo offset the then current 3-volume British hardcover edition to update the text in their editions. In those new reprintings, a number of further corrections overseen by Christopher Tolkien were added, and the errant Ballantine branch of revision, including the Bulgar edition, was integrated into the main branch of textual descent. This method of correction involved a cut and paste process with printed versions of the text. Beginning with the 1987 Houghton Mifflin edition, an earlier version of this note on the text, dated October 1986, was added to The Lord of the Rings. The note has been reworked 3 times since then, and the version dated April 1993 first appeared in 1994, and the version dated April 2002 came out later that year. The present note replaces and supersedes all previous versions. For the 1994 British edition, published by HarperCollins, the text of The Lord of the Rings was entered into a word processing files. This next stage of textual evolution came about to allow for a greater uniformity of the text in all future editions, but with it inevitably came new wrinkles. Some new misreadings entered into the text, while at the same time others were fixed. In the worst instance, one line of the ring inscription in the chapter The Shadow of the Past, the Fellowship of the Ring, was simply dropped. Unforeseeable glitches arose in other editions when the base computerized text was transferred into a page-making or typesetting programs, e.g. in The Fellowship of the Ring, the closing 2 sentences of The Council of Elrond simply and inexplicably disappeared. Such glitches have been very much the exception, not the rule, and the text has otherwise maintained a consistency and integrity throughout its computerized evolution. The 1994 edition also contained a number of new corrections, again supervised by Christopher Tolkien, as well as a reconfigured index of names and page references. The 1994 was first used in American editions published by Houghton Mifflin in 1999. A small number of further corrections were added into the 2002 3-volume edition, illustrated by Alan Lee, published by HarperCollins in Great Britain and Houghton Mifflin in the United States. The textual history of The Lord of the Rings, merely in its published form, is a vast and complex web. In this brief note, I have given only a glimpse of the overall sequence and structure. Further details on the revisions and corrections made over the years to the published text of The Lord of the Rings, and a fuller account of its publishing history, may be found in J.R.R. Tolkien, A Descriptive Bibliography by Wayne G. Hammond, with the assistance of Douglas A. Anderson, 1993. For those interested in observing the gradual evolving of The Lord of the Rings from its earlier drafts to its published form, I highly recommend Christopher Tolkien's account, which appears within 5 volumes of his 12-volume series, The History of Middle-earth. Volumes 6 through 9 contain the major part of his study pertaining to The Lord of the Rings: The Turn of the Shadow, 1998, The Treason of Isengard, 1989, The War of the Ring, 1990, and Sauron Defeated, 1992. Also, the final book of the series, The Peoples of Middle-earth, 1996, cover the evolution of the prologue and appendices to The Lord of the Rings. These volumes contain an engrossing, over-the-shoulder account of the growth and writing of Tolkien's masterpiece. The process of studying Tolkien's manuscripts of The Lord of the Rings involved the deciphering of versions where Tolkien wrote first in pencil and then in ink atop the pencil draft. Christopher Tolkien has described his father's method of composition in The Return of the Shadow, and the handwriting that he used for rapid drafts and sketches, not intended to endure long before he turned to them again and gave them a more workable form. The letters are so loosely formed that a word which cannot be deduced or guessed at from the context or from later versions can prove perfectly opaque after long examination, and if, as he often did, used a soft pencil, much has now become blurred and faint. The true difficulty of reading such double drafts can be observed in the frontispiece to The War of the Ring, which reproduces in color Tolkien's illustration of Shelob Lair from a page of Tolkien's manuscript. Looking very closely at the hasty ink draft alongside the illustration, one can see underneath it the earlier, hastier pencil draft. Also, in The War of the Ring, Christopher Tolkien reproduces a page from the first manuscript on the chapter The Taming of Smeagol, and printed text corresponding to this text is the facing page, see pp. 90 through 91. One is astonished at anyone's ability to decipher such text. That difficulty aside, just what do these books signify to ordinary readers and to Tolkien scholars? And what is the history of the writing of a book? Simplified, these volumes show in great detail the development of the story of The Lord of the Rings from its very earliest drafts and hasty projections through its completion. We see in the earliest materials what is very much a children's book, a sequel to The Hobbit, and as the story grows through various phases, there is an increase in seriousness and depth. we see alternate branches of development, the gradual blending and merging of certain characters, and the slow emergence of the nature of the rings and of the motivations of other characters. Some of these various ideas are abandoned altogether, while others are reworked into some variant form that may or may not survive into the final version. One could make a whole catalog of interesting tidbits from Christopher Tolkien's studies, such as the fact that Strider was called Strider until a very late stage in the writing of the book. That Strider was at once a hobbit, so named because he wore wooden shoes. That Tolkien is at one point considered a romance between Aragorn and Eowyn. That Tolkien wrote an epilogue to the book tying up loose ends, but it was dropped before publication and now appears in Sauron Defeated, and so on. But these developments are best appreciated when read within the context of Christopher Tolkien's commentary rather than discussed separately. The most significant achievement in these volumes is that they show us how Tolkien wrote and thought. Nowhere else do we see the authorial process itself at work in such detail. Tolkien's hastiest comments about where the story might proceed or why it can or can't go such and such a way, these queries to himself were written out. Tolkien is literally thinking on paper. This gives us an added dimension of understanding Tolkien's comment to Stanley Unwin in a 1963 letter that when suffering from trouble with his shoulder and right arm, I found not being able to use a pen or a pencil as defeating as the loss of her beak would to be a hen, and we, as the readers of these volumes, can share with Tolkien himself the wonder and bewilderment of new characters appearing as if from nowhere, or of some other sudden change or development at the very moment of their emergence into the story. I know no other instance in literature where we have such a history of the writing of a book, told mostly by the author himself, with all the hesitations and false paths laid out before us, sorted out, commented upon, and served up to a reader like a feast. We are shown innumerable instances in the minutest detail of the thought process itself at work. We see this author fully absorbed in creation for its own sake, and this is all the more exceptional because this is a history not only of the unfolding of a story and its text, but of the evolution of a world. There is an additional wealth of material beyond simple narrative text. There are maps and illustrations, there are languages and writing systems, and the histories of the peoples who spoke and wrote in these systems. All of these additional materials add multiple dimensions of complexity to our appreciation of the invented world itself. 50 years into the published life of The Lord of the Rings, it seems extraordinary to me that we have not only such a masterful work of literature, but also companion to it an unparalleled account of its writing. Our gratitude as readers goes to both of the Tolkien's father and son. Douglas A. Anderson, May 2004.